In this video, we're going to learn how to make three types of graphs. The first one is a line graph or a time series graph. The second one is going to be a scatter plot, so two variables with dots to show their x and y axis coordinates. And then the last one is going to be a histogram so that we can see the normality or the distribution of variables. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and load what we've already run. So I have my correlations and I have my summarizing, and this tells me a lot, but maybe a simple graph would tell me something as well. So let's see what GDP looks like over time. So to do that, we use a two-way plot. So we go two-way, and then in parentheses we're going to go line, and that's going to tell us that we're going to be making a line chart or a time series. And we want to do GDP versus the day, so it's going to put the day or the time on the x-axis and GDP on the y-axis. Go ahead and run that. I think we need to comma sort. We did that to sort on the day on the x-axis. So we sorted here, and this is the output that we get. So here's 1960, January 1st, 1960, which is what we have, and then it goes all the way up to the second quarter of 2014, or 2015, excuse me. And what we see is GDP climbing, and our average was about 8.8. So here's our average of those numbers. But we see GDP going up, and this is the basic GDP graph where we see fairly steady growth, but with some recessions and some expansions in there. Here's the financial crisis, 2007-2008. So another thing that we may want to do is not just look at GDP, but we want to look at, let's say we want to add in the unemployment rate. So how does GDP and the unemployment rate look on the same graph? So if we type in the unemployment rate, and we run this, this is what we get. We get GDP going up, and our unemployment rate looks like a flat line at 0. And unemployment obviously isn't a flat line at 0, but the reason that we're seeing this is because we have one scale. So we're trying to fit something with really, really large numbers against something that doesn't go really above 10%. So we're looking at very, very small numbers compared to very large numbers, and the large numbers are dominating. So it just compresses the unemployment rate at 0. So what we really need to do is add a second axis. What we're going to do now is add that second axis by going back, and we're going to delete this, and we're going to put line UN rate day, and they're going to have this line GDP day. We're going to sort y-axis 2, so to verify that we have a second y-axis. We run this, we obviously have to sort here too. And this is what we get. So we have GDP looking like it was, and here's our scale, so it's the exact same scale as we saw in the first one. But now our unemployment shows the variation that we have. So we have unemployment going up to 10% in, well, since we're using quarterly data, it doesn't quite reach 10%. And then in the 1980s, it goes above 10%. So we have unemployment, and then here's 4 to 12% is the scale, and then for GDP it's 0 to $15 trillion. And so we have GDP and our unemployment rate. So that tells us our time series graph. Another thing that we may want to look at is, what does this look like? So if I were to take the first quarter of January 1960 for unemployment rate and GDP, and I were to plot these as a scatter plot, what do those look like? So the second plot that I'm going to do is a two-way. Instead of a line, we're going to do a scatter. and then I'm going to go UN rate and GDP. And I don't need to sort this because it just takes the pairwise. It's going to take each one and plot it in XY space. So we go ahead and run this, and this is what we get. So unemployment rate, which is the first one, is going to be on the y-axis. GDP is going to be on the x. And what we see is GDP varies from very low, so about 250 to 16 trillion, while the unemployment rate goes up and down. So we don't really see a large correlation between the unemployment rate and GDP. And that's simply because GDP has been growing fairly constantly while the unemployment rate goes down. So if we took the time series of the unemployment rate over time, it would look almost identical to this plot. If we go back and instead of the unemployment rate, if we did the CPI, we know that GDP and the CPI were very highly correlated, so we should see something that looks almost like a straight line. And we do that, and sure enough, here's what we see. As GDP gets higher, the CPI gets higher. So we see almost this linear trend, or we see something that moves very closely together, and that's what the correlation told us anyway. So looking at a line graph tells us how things move over time, while looking at the scatter plot tells us what are the correlations, a visual correlation between GDP and the CPI. The last thing that we may want to do is look at a histogram. So how does the unemployment rate stack up versus itself? So are there very abnormal unemployment rates and something that's typically very a high probability of being at? So to get a histogram, we just type in histogram, and we'll put UN rate. We'll go ahead and run this, and this is what we see. So we see this is the density, so 40% of our data on unemployment rate comes in at about 5.5%, while 10% and above are less than 10% probability. And in fact, 8% all the way up to 10%, each little box here represents less than 10%. If we added these together, that would be the probability of getting 8% to above 10%. So this is like our probability density function. And what we see is we see a very, very high number right here, and higher numbers below. We see some very high numbers. The tail is much wider to the right than it is to the left, but we see a lot more numbers, so a higher density because of that lower tail on the left.